Americans had much to fear as the new year 1941 approached. Just 7 months earlier, the Nazi blitzkrieg had rolled over Belgium, France, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. British forces barely escaped at Dunkirk, only to face the relentless bombing of the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain and the Blitz.
It was a dark and dismal time in American and world history. The Nazis had swept through Europe. England was teetering on collapse. The Japanese had taken over huge swaths of China, were moving into Indochina, were clearly militaristic and expansionist. The American economy had started to improve, but there were still fairly high levels of unemployment. And Americans were really concerned that they did not want to get involved in this European war.
You have the confidence.
And although President Franklin D. Roosevelt had been reelected in November, promising to keep the United States out of the intensifying war, the nation found itself shifting to a wartime footing.
And most important, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. For the first time in our history, we began mobilizing an army while still at peace.
In the wake of the Nazi successes, the president himself had expressed America's uneasiness.
During the past few years, you and I have seen event follow event, each and every one of them a shock to our hopes for the peaceful development of modern civilization as we know it.
FDR soon told Americans that they should be wary of the four fears: the fear of not being able to worship freely, the fear of losing freedom of expression, the fear of military arms, and the fear that the war would damage free commerce among nations.
Have been cruelly invaded.
But now it was New Year's Day, 1941, and it was time to look forward. Within the White House, President Roosevelt and his advisors were preparing for the annual message to Congress. Suddenly, FDR leaned back in his chair. In a moment, he would ask his secretary to take down an idea for a new finale to the upcoming speech. It would not be four fears, but four freedoms.
As he was sitting there, he was thinking about the imperative of coming up with a set of words that would lift the speech beyond the idea that we have reason to fear the Axis powers, we have reason to believe and reason to hope that we can make a difference. So he articulates, sitting at his desk with his speechwriters, he actually articulates right out of his head these famous words: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear.
Perhaps as the president's thinking shifted from fears to freedoms throughout 1940, he had remembered inaugurating the 1939 New York World's Fair near Leo Friedlander's 4 sculptured tributes to the freedoms of speech, press, religion, and assembly. Or perhaps he had been inspired by Frank Knox, then publisher of the Chicago Daily News, who spoke to 1940 audiences about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religious belief, and freedom from fear. The president's inner thoughts from that New Year's Day have been lost, but his timeless words remain. The 4th draft of the message to Congress, now preserved at the FDR Library, reveals the first complete appearance of an ideal that would reshape the world. Less than a week later, on January 6, 1941, Roosevelt presented his address before Congress. It was a passionate defense of the Lend-Lease program to export weapons to the Allies in their fight against Hitler and the other Axis dictators. Via radio, much of the nation listened in, and the speech would soon travel across the world in 6 different languages. The Four Freedoms passage came near the end of the address.
In the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world.
He really wanted this point of these are not freedoms just for us. These are freedoms for people everywhere in the world. And he says it 4 times. And each time he says it, you can tell that there's a way that he leans forward and emphasizes the words. And he felt that in some ways that was the most important part of this section of the speech. But it had been hotly debated because his advisors were saying, make this about America. And he was saying, no, this is about all people.
Yet the White House was to face disappointment in the days following the speech. Surprisingly, journalists and members of Congress largely overlooked the 4 freedoms, focusing instead on the Lend-Lease proposal. Even average Americans who wrote hundreds of letters to FDR in the subsequent week did not seem to understand the president's new ideal. But Roosevelt was undaunted. The White House soon opened a 4 freedoms publicity campaign. The president pitched his ideal in more and more speeches.
It is significant that at a critical moment like this,
Sumner Welles, the Undersecretary of State, published a new book, The World of the 4 Freedoms. And when Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met off the coast of Canada in the summer of 1941, Roosevelt made sure the 4 freedoms were part of the discussion. But the 4 freedoms still struggled to capture the public's imagination. After Pearl Harbor, the administration turned the 4 Freedoms campaign over to its propaganda experts. They brought in star writers like E.B. White and Henry Pringle to explain the 4 Freedoms to the public in an official pamphlet. When not even the pamphlet's wide distribution and famous authors could convince Americans to read it, the administration began to worry. George Gallup, who conducted private polls for the White House, wrote privately to FDR that the nation needed a battle cry. But the 4 Freedoms had still not registered a very deep imprint here at home. The president's reply to Gallup revealed his own frustration. I am a bit appalled by the percentage of people who have no clear idea of what the war is about. By early 1943, a year or so after Pearl Harbor, the Office of War Information was ready to give up on the 4 Freedoms altogether, privately calling the theme a flop.
So at this point they said, how do we make the 4 Freedoms something that's not just the president's idea, but something that people are really living? And so they engaged those same mechanisms that they used during the New Deal to promote this idea. So you started seeing songs come out about the 4 Freedoms. You started seeing art come out about 4 Freedoms. There were some plays that were written about it. You start seeing posters appear. And so this campaign sort of starts getting going, and at a certain point it takes on its own life, where people were deciding they want to use these ideas in their expression, whatever art form it was.
Norman Rockwell's 1943 4 Freedoms were part of the artistic effort. Thanks to the reach of the Saturday Evening Post, the 4 interpretations caught the public's imagination. Soon the 4 Freedoms had gained a foothold in America's imagination, and the president's ideal began to resonate.
To Americans, to see freedom of speech embodied in that Lincoln-esque figure in the painting, a man who was the mechanic in town, who was being viewed by the others around him in shirt and tie or whatever else, the local professionals. That was the American ideal of democracy, that we all have a voice, freedom of speech and expression. So Rockwell puts into these images, these very powerful images, the things that Americans had no difficulty relating to. Nothing abstract there.
As the president himself wrote to the Post, "I'm grateful for the reproductions of Norman Rockwell's paintings illustrating the four freedoms. He has done a superb job in bringing home the plain, everyday truths behind them." By the end of the war, with the president's death, Eleanor Roosevelt took responsibility for the four freedoms, working tirelessly to see that they were included in the United Nations founding documents.
I mean, she had a continuing evolution of what democracy meant and what sacrifice and what courage it took from citizens to make democracy real. And so it was a contract, she would say, between government and the people. She would say, we cannot leave our problems to the government. We are the government. And she would say, just as the government has a responsibility to us, we have a responsibility to make the government of our dreams become real. So when she goes to the United Nations in January 1946, she is known around the world for speaking out on racial justice. She's known around the world for speaking out on the horrors of war. She is known around the United States for being the administration's most articulate voice on housing and hunger and employment and conscience. And so when she goes to the UN, she has this innate, gut-level commitment to the four freedoms in her DNA.
And I think when you look, if you ever visit the Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island in New York, it's right at the end of the island, and of course you look across and there's the United Nations. And really the four freedoms are the foundation on which the whole concept of the United Nations was built. Freedom for everyone in the world, right? And the United Nations is designed to be that organization that implements that. So in some ways you could say the United Nations is the ultimate legacy of the four freedoms.
Today, FDR's four freedoms are now enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They appear in national constitutions, and they are an ever-present ideal representing the highest values of humanity. This legacy would have delighted President Franklin D. Roosevelt, that brilliant orator and statesman who worked so tirelessly late into the night on that fearful New Year's Day so long ago.